I suppose from the point of view of the education system, we were here to work. We were here to fill the places in the labour market, not to go to college. And clearly there were people from Africa and Asia who were perceived as going back home to take over and run the country, and they needed to be educated. And I think in general they were treated quite well. But from the point of view of a migrant and our relationship to the educational establishment, we tended to be at best tolerated, at worst excluded. There was no real sense that you were welcome within the education establishment, and that went for secondary and higher education.
Britain's universities had long been bastions of privilege. In the post-war years, only about 3% of the population were able to go to university, and the issue that dominated the ivory towers then was the struggle to open up the campuses to more students from working-class backgrounds. But the ideas that were gaining ground in America about affirmative action were not on the agenda. And at the same time, the educational aspirations of many immigrants began to take second place to more immediate concerns.
Think about the moment when Afro-Caribbeans came to this country in the middle of the last century. It all took place in about 7 years. People arrived, they began looking for jobs against the most immense network of discrimination. They began looking for places to live, which was actually more difficult than finding a job. For everybody, life was an immense struggle. And I think clearly things like education were the first ideas to go, partly because there was a brick wall.
It was not only the aspirations of parents that were challenged by the difficulties facing Britain's early black immigrants. Black children very early on began to fall behind and fail in many British schools.
I think that the first generation of post-war immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean had high aspirations for themselves and for their children. And although many people who came to Britain from Africa and the Caribbean came in order to pursue their educational careers, their children often found it much more difficult to pursue their educational careers. And in the 1960s and 1970s, there was a problem of African and particularly Caribbean young people being designated educationally subnormal. We think of the low aspirations that there very often were for children from African and Caribbean backgrounds. So I think this prevented the children of these backgrounds furthering their education, going into higher education, going into certain professions.
Black people had originally been encouraged to emigrate to Britain in order to do certain jobs during the post-war labour shortages. When the first of their children came to leave the British school system, many found themselves pushed into these same sorts of jobs, often at the expense of any educational aspirations. Rosamund Lawrence went to school in London's East End in the 1960s.
I had to make a decision about my life, what I wanted to do. I really wanted a job which I liked, and the teachers I found in my second school were saying to me, well, you cannot do this and you cannot do that. I wanted to be secretary, and I was adamant I wanted to go and learn the processes to lead me into into a secretarial job. I remember one career advice lady saying to me, well, we don't really have black people doing secretarial jobs, and it would not be a good thing. I think you would be much suited to doing nursing. There are lots of bedpans to be cleaned. And I said, well, I do not want to be a nurse. But the worst thing was that you would take in notes home to your mum or your parents, in fact, and you were not seeing the notes that the teachers were giving you to take home. And I remember Mum saying to me, I'm going to get a form to fill in for you to join nursing. And she actually did go and get that form because the school had written to her and they advised her and they thought I should enter nursing. If only West Indian people did question what well, the white society said, then maybe a lot of us would have had better jobs.
The idea that immigrants were only here to do a certain job for a limited period of time was obviously very current in the 1960s and 1970s. So I think this also had an impact on the education system, and particularly the expectations of what young black people should aspire to, what they could achieve. And again, there were not the role models there to perhaps encourage people to go on to university, to seek careers in certain areas of society. And of course, in 1968, we have Enoch Powell's River of Blood speech and so on, the rise of organized racism from the fascist organizations and so on.
1968 was perhaps the high watermark of racism in Britain. But in the US, it started off as a year of optimism. Black people were now entering the nation's once all-white universities in numbers that would have seemed impossible only a few years earlier. But a single event outside the universities meant that the affirmative action experiment was to take on a radical new agenda that would transform American intellectual life in a single generation.
At 7:10 this evening, Martin Luther King was shot in Tennessee. Martin Luther King, 20 minutes ago, died.
In the aftermath of Martin Luther King's assassination, America's cities were convulsed by riots and violence. The black students who came to university out of this experience were very different from the first outnumbered passive Negro students who'd first entered the white universities a decade earlier.
It was when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April the 4th, 1968, that conditions on white university campuses changed almost overnight. On hundreds of campuses, black student unions were formed. Hundreds of thousands of people were in the street, millions actually, demonstrating against the war in Vietnam. The Black Power period was at its height with the Black Panther Party and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers that were challenging white hegemony both on campus and in our communities. White liberal higher education decided that the time had come to desegregate the campuses. And Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, and Cornell, and other elite institutions opened the gates, opened the doors to larger numbers of African Americans. We saw ourselves as a generation on the cusp of history. We believed deeply that we could change the course of history. We could change the way things are by the power of our ideas.
It was in the late 1960s that the civil rights movement evolved into the Black Power movement. Here was a generation radicalized by the murder of Martin Luther King. Affirmative action brought them face to face with conservative university administrators in charge of institutions that had been exclusively white for centuries. It took only a few months for these forces to clash. James Turner and Andre McLaughlin are both now academics. But in the late 1960s, they were members of the student generation who took on the prestigious Cornell University. Cornell's first intake of affirmative action students arrived on a campus where they confronted racism and had no access to black academic courses. These grievances came to a head one weekend in May 1969.
It was Parents' Weekend, and so it was the best weekend in the world to do something.
The administration wanted the weekend to go smoothly to prove, well, see, our experiment with these black students is working out well. And what would happen? The opposite. That what these parents saw with these black students coming, telling them, you have to get out. And we've taken over this building and we've seized it. It was a very dangerous situation and very tense for about 72 hours. There were many, many whites on the campus and in the general community who were arming. And they were coming up and said, we're going to take care of these black people in the old-fashioned way, the way we've always taken care of them. When they get out of hand, they won't stay in their place, we come up and deal with them. But at the same time, white America wasn't prepared to see white students beaten up by the police or harmed in order to get at black students. And that was the critical thing. The white students stood around the building. And now in order to get to black students, which America was used to, violence against blacks, but to get to them, they had to come through these white students. And that was the risk they weren't prepared to take. And there were people who from all around the black community nationally were supporting the students and were threatening to come. So the university knew that it was in a bigger situation than what it expected, and that in fact the only reasonable way for them was to come to terms with making an accommodation, a compromise.
After 3 days, Cornell University agreed to a set of demands that gave its black students protection from racism, new courses, and black lecturers. Affirmative action was now producing results that no one had predicted, but the siege of Cornell was also about to become an icon of black power.
There's this very dramatic picture of the students coming out, and they're armed. One young man, I think he had gone to West Point and had transferred to Cornell, so he was the most military. He had his gun, his rifle in his arm, properly cocked, and he had this bandolier of bullets, and their face was absolutely stern. There was no smiling. See, and this was very important too, because the folklore of American history always took black people to be smiling, to be jesters, to be joking. They were determined, and the university was absolutely scandalized by it. But it electrified students across the country. Everyone said, wow, look what those brothers and sisters have done.
America's universities had presumed that black students could be made to fit in. What happened was the opposite. The black students transformed the universities. And affirmative action achieved another key victory. One of that generation's central demands was the creation of courses that reflected black history and the experiences of black Americans. The result was a new subject, African American Studies, a subject whose equivalent has still never been properly established within the British university system. Today, hundreds of African American or Black Studies programs are taught across the US university system. They're amongst the most oversubscribed courses on offer, as popular with white students as black.
For me and other members of my generation, the presence of Afro-American studies in the academy is just as natural as the presence of the chemistry department or the math department, the history department or the English department. There's nothing anomalous about it.